Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin.com friends and Formula One fans. After another insane Formula One race of the 2024 season, the Hungarian Grand Prix, it did not disappoint at all. Oscar Piastri was able to celebrate his first Grand Prix success, but there is a big but. 3 laps before the end of the race, he was let past by Lando Norris, his own teammate, which obviously left a bad taste in his mouth. Now the question occurs, did the right McLaren driver win? Yes or no? There is a lot of discussion and we want to take a closer look at this first. Norris was on pole but couldn't really convert that into a lead. Piastri went into first at the start. Norris first into third, then into second because Verstappen had to, was allowed to, wanted to, whatever. Yes, and then the McLaren drivers were at the front in the order of Piastri and Norris for a relatively long time in the race until the second pit stop. On lap 45, Lando Norris was surprisingly the first McLaren driver to be called in for a stop, and that is very unusual because the first driver to come in has fresh tires earlier, can go faster earlier, and usually overtakes the other driver if they are close together beforehand. The classic undercut, and that's exactly what happened. 2 laps later, Piastri came in for a stop, came out again behind Norris, and then the chaos was perfect. Then McLaren said yes, they want to reverse the order and Lando Norris should help and let Piastri pass. Then at some point they said yes, if Piastri is close then they'll turn around. It was quite a mess if you listen to the radio traffic. In the meantime, Lando Norris didn't really react to it either. His race engineer even wanted to know if the radio was working at all. It was quite amusing as a neutral spectator, but certainly not so amusing from a team perspective. At some point on lap 67, 3 laps before the end of the race, Norris managed to persuade himself to give up the position again. Team boss Andrea Stella said afterwards that it was clear to him anyway, he knows Lando Norris, he knows what a team player he can be or what a team player he is, and therefore everything was easy. It was clear that he would give the position back. But Norris himself says yes, somehow he went a bit crazy during the race thinking about it. On the one hand, of course, you have to be selfish in this sport, but on the other hand, he is a team player. He then also contradicted himself a bit because of course he hesitated for a long time, but then in the end he said, yes, it was always clear to him that he would give up the position. But he says that McLaren made it unnecessarily difficult for themselves because why didn't they get Oscar Piastri first? Then it wouldn't have come about like this. He says himself that in the end it's fair the way it went. He lost the win at the start. Nothing was stolen from him. But what is McLaren's reasoning? Why did they make it so difficult for themselves? You have to go back into the race. Lewis Hamilton came in for a stop on lap 40. He was in third place at that point, about 10 seconds behind the leader, behind Piastri, and about 9 seconds behind Norris. And then, yes, 10 seconds. That's not an easy undercut. You can stay out there from McLaren's point of view. And McLaren wanted to stay out because they wanted to extend this third stint. They wanted the final stint to be on the medium tires again. They wanted to keep it as short as possible because they were afraid of running out of tires at the end, and that's why they wanted to stay out, okay, but not stay out too long so that they didn't collect Hamilton's undercut. That's why they stayed out, and then they said, okay, the most vulnerable to the undercut is Norris and not Piastri, so they brought him in first. Now you can have a really good discussion about whether that was necessary. 10 seconds, and it was still about 5 seconds at that point. Stella told us that yes, they simply didn't want to take any risks. They didn't want to put pressure on the pit crew to deliver a 3-second stop. They would rather take responsibility to the command post and sort it out there than put pressure on their own pit crew. You've all seen how it turned out. I think in hindsight McLaren would have done it a bit differently, solved the whole thing a bit more elegantly. So you have to be honest, they actually gave Norris every chance of victory because he was able to put pressure on Piastri in the third stint. He also made a mistake in the meantime. Who's to say that wouldn't have happened again in the final stint? On the other hand, you can of course say that Norris could have let Piastri pass immediately, then he would have had the whole stint to put the pressure on again, and in the end he made room 3 laps earlier, because theoretically there could have been a safety car and then you would have looked really stupid. So it really was a very, very unfortunate situation from McLaren's point of view, and that with a double victory you have to imagine that In addition, Lando Norris also started to think a bit, he admitted that, because he was also thinking about the Drivers' Championship and that 7 points between first and second place. He's currently on place 2 in the championship, and Piastri is only 5th in the championship, 76 points behind the championship leader Max Verstappen. That's a lot of wood. Norris himself knows that, but he says, it's not that hopeless. He has a bit of faith, and the performance of McLaren in the last few races, especially here at the Hungaroring, gives him a bit of hope, even if it's still a long way off. But McLaren has announced that if they really are in the championship fight and a situation like this should arise, then there will also be a number one driver. Then you can certainly imagine that. But because you already have this team ethos, the other driver will then come voluntarily anyway and say, I'll give up the position if I can help, and so on. I'm curious to see if that really happens. Of course, I hope for all our sakes that we really do get a World Championship fight. Once again, I'd like to remind you that tomorrow you'll get the show with Christian Danner, the AVD Motorsport-Magazin, so submit your questions under the hashtag AskAVD. The second really big story was written by Max Verstappen. Max Verstappen, first of all, at the end on lap 63 of 70, together with Lewis Hamilton, the two met again, and how a collision between the two World Championship continents of 2021, and miraculously neither of them retired, even though Verstappen was meters up in the air with his rear end. So it was a real miracle that they both made it to the finish. But with the better outcome for Hamilton in third place. Verstappen finished 5th, and Max Verstappen said that this collision only came about because Hamilton moved over during the braking sphere, i.e. moving under braking, so he blamed the Briton for it. And I would say he was relatively alone in this view. Lewis Hamilton took a relatively sporting view. He said it was a racing incident and so on. It was a bit complicated because there was also a lapped driver in between. Verstappen arrived with a huge overrun because of this. The stewards also looked at the whole thing and saw Max Verstappen as the guilty party, if I may interpret this decision that way. But they also said Hamilton could have done a bit more to prevent the collision at the end. But Verstappen had lost control of his vehicle at that point. Verstappen's explanation was that he was driven into the braking maneuver by Hamilton in the first place because Hamilton was moving. Hamilton was actually more on his racing line and Verstappen was too far behind, but in the end nothing happened to either of them, and Verstappen actually lost out as a result. Actually, the outcome of the accident has nothing to do with the assessment, but I think in this case it was the case that there was no further action because both of them were able to do something about it. I'm curious to see how you see it. I'm curious to see how our expert sees it, and you can already see there's a lot to discuss again. Also, of course, about Max Verstappen and his behavior, because on the radio, yes, it was really hot, not only with McLaren and Norris, but also with Verstappen and Red Bull. Starting in third position, then giving up second position after taking it unfairly, you can discuss that too. But then you couldn't keep up with the McLaren, and Max Verstappen didn't like that at all. As you know from him, that when things aren't going right, he makes his displeasure known on the radio. But when you also had the wrong strategy, then it really got down to business and it got really colorful. They let Hamilton undercut them, dropped back, and Max Verstappen made it relatively clear that that was the wrong strategy. So I don't want to quote it verbatim at this point, but it got quite heated. You ask yourself whether that was necessary, and Verstappen said yes, it was because he simply didn't want them to make the same mistake again. That's why he had to say it so clearly to his own team. But it shows that things are no longer so wonderful between Verstappen and the team. Verstappen himself said today that some people aren't on the same wavelength. He'd already realized that beforehand, not just during the race. The team completely defended him afterwards. Both Horner and Marco said we completely underestimated how difficult it is to overtake here with the dirty air and so on, and that's why Verstappen's frustration is understandable. I'm curious to see how long it can go on like this at Red Bull, because what Verstappen said there was really, really violent. Of course, you can't really criticize him for his driving, apart from the collision with Hamilton, and technically it's always difficult to criticize performance because you don't know how much was really in there. Certainly not his very best race. Some people also said because he was still gambling until 3:15 a.m. or gambled is a bit disrespectful for that, but the air is actually getting a bit thinner there. Verstappen, by the way, in the direction of critics who don't understand his radio messages and so on, he said they can fuck off. So a lot to discuss. A lot to discuss, certainly also about one or the other driver. Ricciardo, for example, Perez too. We've already secured our current print edition number 97. The candidates for relegation and much more abo.motorsportmagazine.com. You've probably subscribed to this channel. If so, then you'll also receive the AVD Motorsport magazine there in the next few days.